Okay, with 80 in the room, I think we should get started. So good evening, welcome. Thank you for joining us for the presentation of the draft parking and shuttle study findings and recommendations for the Hudson Highlands Fjord Trail. I'm the executive director, Amy Pazala, and we have been working on this study and just really thinking through the system for parking and shuttle that we think is so critical to the whole package of visitation management that this project is seeking to achieve for moving people through this region. So we have from 7 to 8:30 together today, and we hope to use that first with some presentation and then some Q&A discussion. But I'll hand the baton, as it were, to Drew Polinsky, who's the park director for Hudson Highlands Fjord Trail, and he's been the project manager in charge of this study. Drew.
Hi, everyone. Next slide, please. All right, so for the agenda tonight, we'll have a quick introduction, followed by the presentation on the parking study, the shuttle study, preliminary recommendations, and an opportunity for Q&A. When we, on the Q&A portion, you'll see a Q&A field at the bottom of your screen, and you can enter questions at any time during the presentation, whenever you think of them, and they'll be answered at the end of the webinar as time permits during the Q&A section. Don't worry if you don't see your questions, they'll show up when they're being answered. Next slide. So this is an overview of the Fjord project. Most of you are probably familiar. This is going to be a 7.5 mile linear park between Beacon and Cold Spring. And how it pertains to the parking and shuttle project is that we'd like to have an effective parking management and shuttle system for the trail. And I think all of you would as well. We'd like to have the shuttle system up and running when we open phase 1 of the project, which will be essentially Breakneck to Dutchess Manor, and we'll be expanding the parking and shuttle with the project phases. Throughout the project, throughout the shuttle study, we've been considering communities and the impact on communities and adjacent areas to reduce overflow impacts. Next slide. So the need for the parking and shuttle study sort of parallels the Fjord Trail. And we all know how crazy parking along 9D can get, especially around Breakneck. So we'd like to create a system of well-marked parking areas with communication to visitors and resident and all trail users, and an efficient shuttle system to move visitors between parking lots to trailheads and transit. And that should help to encourage transit and incentivize parking at remote lots to reduce congestion on communities. Next slide, please. So we've been very lucky to work with an amazing advisory committee. We have, as a regional project, we have representatives from 2 state agencies, New York State Parks and New York State DOT, Metro North Railroad, 2 counties, Dutchess and Putnam, transit representatives and others, the town of Phillipstown and town of Fishkill, and village of Cold Spring and city of Beacon. So I want to thank all of the committee members for all their time and input into the project. I know there are a number of them on the call here, so thanks everyone. Here's a very brief overview of the study process. We began the study in July 2022 with data gathering. This is a little bit of a simplification. There was feedback throughout the initial system design, stakeholder, and portion of the study, working and meeting with a lot of different groups. Just want to highlight we're at the community feedback portion of this study, where we'll be presenting draft findings and our consultants will be presenting draft findings. And we'll take feedback and use that to form and work with our consultants on the final report and implementation. All right, so we want to make this whole presentation as interactive as possible. Throughout the webinar, there will be an opportunity for feedback via poll questions, and we have a fun introductory question to get you started. All right, we have about 72% of participants have answered the poll. We'll give another couple moments here, and we can close up the poll. This is an important question, even though it's really just a practice. We all, really the trail is about these fun activities, and all of those will be activities that will be encouraged and accessible from the Fjord Trail. And it looks like hiking took the lead here, followed shortly by various boating and beach going. So that's exciting to hear. A little fun question, and we'll go on to our first real question and find out where people are represented from here. All right, we're at about 80% participation here on this question. We'll give another moment and then wrap it up. All right, looks like Cold Spring is coming in the lead here, followed by Phillipstown. So good to see a lot of representation there. And looks like some folks from Beacon, Nelsonville, and some from Fishkill as well. All right, next slide. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our consultant team that'll be presenting the important parts of this presentation here. And we have Stephen Falble, who's the president of Steadman Hill Consulting, presenting from Newport, Vermont. And we have Dan Burkowski, senior transit engineer from Creighton Manning Engineering from Ossining, New York. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Stephen.
Thanks, Drew. I'll just give a quick overview of our project scope, and then Dan will take us through the parking component of the project. I'm the overall parking manager. And these three bullets are obviously a simplified view of what the scope was intended to do. But the first part was to estimate what the potential parking demand would be when the Fjord Trail is built, and then to develop a plan to accommodate that parking. That's not to say we want to provide a parking space for everyone who might drive there, but we don't want people cruising around streets and parking in neighborhoods, creating traffic problems and safety problems. We want to have an adequate supply of parking, but we also want to have a shuttle system that will improve mobility and encourage people to use the train and encourage people moving around in the area to use the shuttle to get around rather than driving from spot to spot. And having designed those two components of this overall system, we're going to create a cost management plan, both for the parking system and the shuttle, that makes it financially viable and sustainable for the system. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan to bring us through the parking analysis.
Thanks, Steve. Get the next slide, please. Next slide again. All right, thanks. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you for your time. So just some baseline stats, just so we're all on the same page. A lot of this is background information for which a lot of the analysis and results are based on. But overall, current visitation to the Hudson Highlands State Park Preserve, so the full area of the Hudson Highlands State Park Preserve is roughly 480,000 people a year. Which is quite high for parking this area. Peak months are September and October, so fall months are typically higher than summer months, with over 60,000 users per month on average for those 2 months. Now, even though that number is for the entire state park preserve, it may not be too surprising to hear that 90% of those visitors are destined to the trails along Route 90, and that is the most popular destination within the entire state park preserve. So what does that mean for car counts? There's some reports and studies that are out there that have been done on visitorship to Breakneck Ridge and the other trails along Route 90, which found that currently 66% of people who come to visit the trails are driving to the trails and to the trailheads, and parking along existing parking lots or parking areas along Route 90, where only 29% of people visiting are arriving by train. And that could be any of the train stations along between Cold Spring and Beacon. We did conduct our own Breakneck Ridge passenger counts at the Metro North station, just to get an idea of how many people are arriving and departing there. And what we found interesting is that there is a imbalance of people who are arriving by train versus those departing. It's about 3 to 1, 2 to 1 people arrive on the northbound train and then depart from somewhere else. So it's reasonable to assume that those people are either deciding to get dinner in Cold Spring or Beacon, or getting a ride from a friend, meeting them there, and getting home some other way besides the train. It's interesting, but not completely surprising, just because of the nature of service there. And if we go to the next slide, we can see some more statistics about how people are getting there. So this this slide here is showing how people are getting to the park and from where. This was based off of a Trail Stewards in-person survey that was conducted over the summer of 2022. And the main takeaways from this is that we can see from this that approximately 78% of people, 77% of people arrive to the Hudson Highland State Park trails from points to the south, where only 23% of people arrive from points to the north. Not completely surprising when you think about where the Hudson River crossings are relative to the park, and also where the most populated areas are from people that are traveling there. Also, possibly not surprising is that the vast majority of people who are arriving by train are arriving from points to south, and the proportion is almost exactly the same. About 77% of people who are arriving by train are arriving from the south, and only 22% are arriving from the north. And again, this is by nature a factor of how the Metro North service is arranged today, where there's only northbound service in the morning and only southbound service in the evening. So what that tells us is the availability of transit significantly impacts the mode choice of people visiting. So if there's a way for them to get there on transit, a convenient way for them to get there on transit, they're going to take transit. And we also found that the average vehicle occupancy of people arriving and driving to the park is around 2.5 people per vehicle. So people are coming in groups, which is a good thing, and that's going to carry through to a lot of our findings. Next slide, please. So the team conducted 2 rounds of parking utilization data, counts. One was in July of 2022, and the second was in the peak month of October 2022. Those counts focus on counting the number of people who are parking within the parking lots, the existing parking lots for the Hudson Highlands State Park, between Cold Spring and Beacon, and also including the full parking utilization of the Beacon Metro North and Cold Spring Metro North parking lots, just to get a sense of how full those are during the peak times. These counts were conducted on a Saturday, mainly focused on the morning periods between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m., which captured the peak arrival times and the peak parking demand times for these lots. On the next slide, the key takeaways from this. So again, probably no surprise, peak parking demand happens in the fall, without a question. The consistent peak parking hour, the hour in which we observe the most number of cars total in all parking lots that we counted, was consistent between the summer and the fall, and that occurred between 12:45 and 1:45, which does make sense. You get an overlap between people who start their days in the morning and people who start their days later in the morning or early afternoon. The parking lots are full. The parking areas are full by around 10:30, and they remain that way until people start leaving in the early afternoon. So by 10:30, all the lots are full. Current spot turnover rate is low. We estimated about 1.5. Each spot turns over about 1.5 times per day, and that is consistent with the current, or makes sense with the current use of the park, where people typically go for hikes lasting at least 3-4 hours. So unless you're getting a spot from somebody who got there early in the morning and you're getting there early in the afternoon, these spots don't turn over all that much. There is significant parking capacity that exists at the Beacon Metro North station, and it's a very large parking area. Even during unrelated events unrelated to Hudson Highlands State Park, there's still a large amount of parking available there. Even during Yankee games, there was in the summer there was a lot of parking available there on Saturdays. Again, probably surprising no one, the shoulders of Route 9D were observed in October to be about 10 to 25% above capacity, meaning more people park there than there are space for people to park legally. People park in very interesting ways, not necessarily safe. And the other observation was that there was no active parking enforcement observed in these areas at any point during our observations or any time that we spent out there. So there's no one actually enforcing the parking rules, keeping people to where they're supposed to park. People just park where they can. So next slide. So really quickly, this just gives you a visual overview of kind of the conditions I was just talking about. So this was the utilization in the Washburn Trail, Little Stony Point parking lot. So the orange line represents the fall, the October count, and the green line represents the summer count. And again, you can see by 10:30, that lot was almost full and remained full throughout the count period. Same thing on the next slide with the shoulder parking areas of Route 9D. Again, same color scheme. Again, same key takeaway. Those areas are full by mid-morning, and they remain that way. And then you can see the shoulder of 9D overparked in the fall. Again, probably not a complete surprise, but interesting to look at nonetheless. So next slide, please. So the main charge of our project here is to try to estimate what the future parking demand is, and also make sure or try to make sure that we have enough space for everyone to park while not providing too much parking and trying to incentivize transit, right? So like I said, currently 66% of people who drive to Hudson Highlands State Preserve, who visit Hudson Highlands State Preserve, are driving. However, in the future, we expect more people to take transit than they do today. And this is going to be accomplished through a number of ways. One is that now the train actually connects to, or once the full project is completed, will connect to the trail termini in Beacon and Cold Spring. There's also other incentives that we're going to talk about in a minute about how we expect to get people to transit. But it's also a messaging, marketing campaign strategy that we'll hope to roll out to try to encourage people to take transit. The shuttle system itself is going to be another incentivization for transit. You know, we can tell people that there'll be a frequent service at the train stations that'll get people hopefully to take the train more and be confident that once they get there, they'll have a quick, convenient, comfortable ride to anywhere within the park that they want to go. So to mitigate the traffic and congestion issues that currently are expected, and without any other changes probably wouldn't go anywhere, we are planning on adding several new off-street parking areas within the Hudson Highlands Fjord Trail parking lot. So that'll take care of some of that over demand that we see today. There is a plan to implement parking fees at all lots. And how does that mitigate traffic congestion? Well, what we're saying is that the plan right now is that all parking will be charged a flat daily rate. And what that'll do is disincentivize somebody from driving from one area of the trail and then taking their car to drive to another area of the trail after they spent some time in one or the other. And that also incentivizes people to take the shuttle, which Stephen will talk about a little bit later. But the convenient shuttle service will allow them to, you know, park for that daily rate, leave their car there, take the convenient shuttle, and get to where they want to go. And then, yeah, working with local partners to reduce unsafe parking and spillover. So with some of the companion parking controls, which we're going to also review in just a minute. Next slide, please. So what are the demand estimates? So what we did is we took a look at some existing studies that were done by others and looked at current park visitor attendance that's collected by New York State Parks and did some math to try to figure out what the estimate's going to be. So what you're seeing here is our current peak October 2021 attendance upscaled by the projected growth rate to the 2028 opening of the park. And what we did here is we took the full attendance of the Hudson Highlands State Park Preserve and kind of use that full attendance, not just the 85-90% that go to locations along 9D, so that we can provide a conservative estimate of what the parking demand might be. And then the second half, or the middle part of this table, is kind of looking at, well, what does different mode splits between visitors mean for parking demand? So the first column projected no mode change. That is essentially saying we are not going to be able to impact the behavior of people who visit the park over existing conditions, which we do not think is true, but we're keeping that as a baseline, meaning 66% of people who visit the trail in the future are going to drive, just like 66% of the people who visit the park today are going to drive. So it keeps the same exact split with no change in transit, no change in driving, and kind of does a calculation for how much parking that would need. The middle section says, okay, well, let's say we can assume a modest transit shift. So that says we take our transit mode share from 29% to 35%, so a 6% increase in transit usage over today. And then the last column is the same numbers, except it's reasonable to assume that once the trail connects to downtown Beacon and downtown Cold Spring, that a portion of the future growth visitors are going to be people who live along the 90 corridor and who may be recreating for the day or taking their bike or walking along the trail on the weekend, which is also the peak time. So we said, okay, well, there's probably going to be a increase in the mode share of people walking and biking to the trail in the future. So if we take those assumptions, what we end up with is a kind of a range of parking demand, with the high estimate being no change from behavior today, and the low estimate being, our relatively modest assumptions for modal shift in the future. And what we can see is that transit use has an outsized effect on parking demand, which does make sense. And again, if the part whatever we can do to push that mode shift through the shuttle, through parking fees, through other strategies, is going to kind of push people to use transit more than driving. So the last part of this is the actual meat and potatoes of this. So first line, peak observed cars. So that's the maximum number of cars that we saw parked at any time in all of the lots along 9D, excluding the Metro North station. So this is only between Little Stony Point and Mount Beacon. It was 317 cars in those, just that middle section. And so based on our projections, depending if you look at the high estimate or the low estimate, what we're finding is that we project we're going to need between 130 and 220 additional parking spaces beyond what we have today. And again, that does not include either Metro North station. It's just within the confines of the Hudson Highlands State Park. So again, we want to account for both potentials in case we aren't able to induce a modal shift, but we don't think that is we don't think some level of modal shift is reasonable. So 130 to 220 additional parking spaces would be required to accommodate future demand projections. So the next slide kind of gives you an idea of the existing parking supply and what is currently on the table for the future parking supply. So you see on the left, 4 of these locations do not exist today. They are planned to either be built or expanded, and so the middle 4 are ones that do exist today. You also notice that some of the existing capacity of the 4 lots that do exist today are actually reduced under future conditions, and that capacity is reduced because of traffic calming measures or other measures that are going to be put in place to kind of organize the parking, introduce pedestrian safety measures and other things. So there is a net reduction in some of the existing parking lots. And then we have the new parking lots, which don't exist today. And if you take the net of those, you end up with currently 387 new parking spaces that are going to be created over the course of this project that don't exist today. So again, our parking projections was 220, and we're right now at 387. Now I should say that these numbers are in flux. There's some things that are still being decided. That number might come down, but the point is that we have our projected number and we have our projected supply, and right now the supply is sufficient to accommodate future demand. Next slide, please. So the next thing we want to talk about is well, how are we going to enforce, how are we going to collect fees? How are we going to collect these daily parking fees that I mentioned? And how are we going to enforce them? So this was kind of a technology overview where we tried to look at different methods that are out there and try to do kind of like a high level comparative advantage. So in terms of parking fee collection and the enforcement of the parking fee collection, we're looking at kind of 4 different ways to do it, right? So one is the old school man booths where you have someone sitting there and collecting fees from people that come in and out. We have an option where, you can install these actuated gate arms where there's a pay collection, there's either a pay collection kiosk or there's a pay collection point of sale kind of card tapper right when you pull up to the gate when you exit, and you can collect fares that way. I'll skip to the 4th one. So payment kiosks. So the difference between payment kiosks and pay on exit would be without actuated gates. It would be more like a New York City or a parking meter where you have to get a ticket and show it in your dashboard kind of thing. And the last one is frictionless parking. So frictionless parking is kind of a new concept in parking management, and it essentially has no gates, no kiosks, and does everything by license plate readers and also through pay by app kind of systems. And then if you don't want to pay by app, you can get a bill in the mail that you can pay at any time. Well, not at any time, but you can pay at your convenience at some point after. So we wanted to take a look at, what are the comparative advantages, understanding that this is a park setting, and trying not to be too disruptive to both traffic flows and aesthetics. So the next slide, what we tried to do is look at these different technologies and a few different metrics and just this is a high level for this presentation, but looking at things that how much do they cost, how much do they cost to operate, how much active enforcement do we actually need to have on site in terms of actual man hours or resources, personnel resources on site to enforce parking, aesthetics, aesthetic impact, traffic impacts. All these things we're kind of looking at, and while we haven't necessarily made a recommendation yet to Hudson Island's Fjord Trail, these are the kind of things that we're kind of looking at. So, man boost, it makes sense. You have to pay somebody to man it. You have to pay somebody's salary benefits to man it. You're paying somebody to actively enforce it, whereas some of these other sources kind of automate some of those processes, right? We also want to be very cognizant because of the nature and geometry of Route 9D that traffic is not delayed getting into these lots. So we're trying to think about technologies that allow people to pay as they exit, as opposed to pay on entry, to kind of reduce the traffic impacts on 9D, reduce delays as much as possible, and any delay incurred would happen on exit as opposed to entry, to get people off of 9D and into these lots as quickly as possible. So the next slide here. So similar to the last, what we were also looking at is, well, what is our strategy for parking monitoring and reporting? And this is important because in the future, when all these parking lots are open, it's going to be a change over what exists today and how people park today. And also, these parking lots are not going to be necessarily evenly distributed within the 7-mile span of the Hudson Highlands Fjord Trail Park. So what we want to do is we want to develop a system that we can communicate to people in real time where parking exists, where they could find parking, and get them to be comfortable with the idea that perhaps they need to park a little bit further north on 90 than a normal breakneck ridge user would today, and not end up in a situation where people are circling or making U-turns on 90 or driving to places where we don't want them to necessarily park. So again, this is kind of a technology overview of different ways we can do it. Man booth is still an option. You can have somebody who's monitoring capacity at various parking lots and reporting that capacity in some way. Pay on exit, it's a similar thing, but all you do is you just have, when the entry gate goes up, you add 1 to your count. When the exit gate goes up, you minus 1 to your count, and you do a little bit of easy math, and you can kind of estimate what your capacity is in any given lot. Mini radars, so these are little actual hockey pucks that sit in the road in each individual space. It can detect whether a space is occupied or not. There's video monitoring, which can look at a full parking lot and through video algorithm and detection, spot and count vacant lots and vacant spots and occupied spots. And then there's license plate readers. This goes along with a couple different technologies, but also the frictionless parking idea, where not only does it count vehicles coming in and out and subtract, add entries and subtract exits, but you can also do things like whitelist employee vehicles, whitelist the shuttle vehicles, whitelist tour buses. So you end up with a more accurate count than you would on just a plus or minus on a gate going up and down. So again, the next slide is a similar kind of comparative analysis of these different technologies on a few different metrics. So one thing that's very important is that this system is accurate. So we want to make sure that we give people good information, so they trust that information, and they're able to get to where parking is available in quickly. We have to be sensitive to system costs, and real-time reporting. I mean, that's kind of integral to this whole system, the ability to report on signage or other things, which we'll talk about in a second. The last column is interesting, specifically about Route 9D and the shoulder parking areas of Route 9D. So which of these technologies can actually be used to monitor and report on occupancy and availability on shoulder parking. So you see most of them cannot, with the exception of the mini radars, because those are in each individual spot. And video monitoring could, but you'd probably end up needing quite a few cameras, because they're mainly designed to look at a wide area as opposed to a linear stretch. But there's pluses and minuses for both, right? The mini radars are much more expensive than anything else. So it's probably going to be some combination of these technologies for the different applications. So the next slide is, so we are looking at what is our fee structure and what is the different fee structure scenario impact on the overall revenue of the system. Now, these are just a sampling of 5 scenarios. There's plenty of shades of gray in between each of these scenarios, but we wanted to just kind of give a sampling of things that we're thinking about and what the overall impact is on parking. So the first scenario here, peak weekend surge pricing with a flat fee at all other time. So that would be our maximum revenue scenario, where it's no matter the season, no matter the day of the week, it's a flat fee plus some level of surge pricing during peak times. That would be our maximum. And then if we take off the surge pricing, you can see that it goes down a little bit. If we start charging half price in the shoulder season we're defining as April to Memorial Day, and then October through Thanksgiving. So kind of the shoulder of the peak seasons. Free on the winters. Again, this is not what it's just an example, but you can see the impact on revenue, and obviously this is an important metric for Hudson Highlands Fjord Trail. So we want to be sensitive to what these different scenarios are going to mean for the project. So next slide. I think we have a poll question now for everyone. Make sure you're all still awake. So the poll question. So this is actually a 3-part question, so take your time answering this. So we want to hear from you what you all think is the best structure and best fee for the Hudson Highlands Fjord Trail lots, whether it's a flat daily fee year round or a peak pricing scheme. Second question is, just what's your idea on what is not only an appropriate fee, but one that would incentivize people potentially to take transit over driving, but also not, turn people off from coming there at all. And the last question, which you might have to scroll down to see if it's not on your screen, there's 3 questions there, is do people think that there is a seasonal parking pass, if seasonal parking pass would be a good idea to offer? All right. 63% still coming in. 67%. All right, that's probably good. 2/3. Thank you for your answers. So let's end the poll and see what we got. Oh, 74%. All right. All right. So yeah, thank you. All right. So looks like 3/4 of folks think that daily fee with peak pricing, higher weekends, fall foliage. So surge pricing is the best fee structure. So that's interesting. Appropriate fees. So it's about split between $10 and $20, with about a quarter of you saying $30 per day. Should mention right now that Metro North round trip ticket is $30 from Grand Central. So just an interesting data point there for you all. And do you think season parking pass should be offered? So yeah, 63% said yes. So that's good to know. Thank you for your answers on that. So the last slide for me is just kind of some thoughts we're talking about now about messaging and reporting of parking capacity. So what we're thinking is it's a multi-pronged strategy. So it's going to have to be a combination of physical wayfinding signage that'll be installed at strategic points along Route 90 in both directions, kind of telling people where the parking is, where the parking is and where they can find it, and also advising people that there will be a shuttle for them to get to other locations. There's also potential to integrate it into both the Hudson Highlands Fjord Trail website and the New York State Parks website, so people can go on before they leave, or check it from their phone and get an idea of where parking is and the status of different parking lots and their capacities. And there's also the option of doing a kind of a smartphone app that has all that information and could also potentially provide you with driving directions with a touch of a button to the nearest parking lot. And even though it's mainly north and south along 9D, that might provide people with some additional confidence that they know where they're going and where they'll find parking. So we do think it's a multi-pronged approach. So we are probably recommending that all three of these are going to be in the final plan. And again, it's about messaging and making people feel comfortable about parking and where they can find parking. And that's it for me. I'll turn it over to Steve now to talk about the shuttle.
Thank you, Dan. That was a lot of information and we're only halfway through. So we thank you for your patience. We'll try to leave enough time for questions and answers at the end, but there's quite a bit more material to get through. So we'll start with the next slide. This is an overview of the sort of the basic alignment of the shuttle route as we're planning it out. You can see it basically follows 9D from Beacon through paralleling the Fjord Trail and down to Cold Spring. Now, I say, and the title of this presentation is Draft Recommendations and Findings, but there are definitely certain things that are not yet decided, and we definitely want your feedback on it as well as feedback of other stakeholders, and those will come up in some poll questions that we have later on. But very little is firmly decided here. This is all up for discussion, and that's why we're doing this public outreach. So you can see the basic alignment. Among all the alternatives we're considering, the northern stops basically remain constant, starting at the Metro North Station at Beacon, stopping at Notch once that's open. That's not open in the first phase, but by 2028, the Notch segment should be available. Duchess Manor and the Visitor Center is a clearly important stop. Breakneck Ridge, Little Stony Point, all those stops would be standard stops. And we have Mount Beacon also marked as a potential stop. That's to be determined with further negotiations about whether that's going to become part of the Fjord Trail system or not. Next slide, please. So there are three options for the southern terminus, and this is what we're very much interested in your feedback and feedback from the village of Cold Spring. And we'll discuss these in some detail. The first option is to terminate the shuttle route at Little Stony Point, really not enter the village of Cold Spring at all. It removes the service from Cold Spring and really discourages people from parking at the Cold Spring Metro North Station or parking anywhere in Cold Spring to be able to get to the shuttle. So they would be encouraged to park at points north of Little Stony Point. The second option would extend the shuttle route into Cold Spring Metro North Station. This would facilitate the use of Cold Spring Station for arrival and departure for people coming from either the north or the south on Metro North, and that could facilitate train arrivals. And the third option is to continue the route south to Boscobel. And the idea here in a partnership with Boscobel would be to capture northbound traffic from New York City, other points south, before it hits Cold Spring. So we'll look at some maps of these and talk about some of the pros and cons starting in the next slide. So alternative one just demonstrates the green line stops there at Little Stony Point. We haven't yet determined exactly how the bus would turn around. It might turn around in the parking lot, or there could be a roundabout potentially. That's yet to be determined. The pros is it prevents the shuttle from getting caught in traffic on Main Street in Cold Spring. And it potentially decreases the amount of people who would park in Cold Spring at the station or elsewhere in Cold Spring to get to the shuttle. This is also the least expensive option to operate because it's the shortest option, and that means fewer buses can run at a higher level of service. The con of this is that people would have to walk from the village to Little Stony Point to catch the shuttle, and that could lead to more pedestrian congestion. Ultimately, when the trail is built, there'll be a very nice way to walk, but until that segment is built later on in this decade, people would be walking along Fair Street or potentially 9D, and that's not ideal. On the next slide, we'll talk about alternative 2, which terminates the shuttle route at the Cold Spring Metro North Station. And there's a couple of different alignments shown here. One is using Fair Street and one is using 9D to Main Street, and both of them might come into play. Fair Street is one way on Sundays, and there are various restrictions there, so they're both in play. This would help support some Main Street businesses. If there were a stop, the people could get on and off along Main Street, and it would provide better transit access for locals between Cold Spring and Beacon, whether or not they're using the Fjord Trail, but presumably most people on the shuttle will be using the Fjord Trail. The cons of this arrangement is that it would increase some traffic on Main Street as the shuttle goes back and forth. It would slow down the shuttle because of Main Street congestion, and it would encourage people to park at the Cold Spring Metro North Station as a free parking location on weekends to catch the shuttle there. And that's not necessarily what the village of Cold Spring wants to encourage. And on the next slide, we look at the third option, which is an extension via 9D to Boscobel. And this is the subject of discussion with Boscobel and their board, and no decisions have been made yet. But the goal here, again, as I said before, would be to capture people coming north on 9D before they get to Cold Spring, encourage them to park at Boscobel, shortens their trip, and then they take the shuttle to get to all of the destinations on the Fjord Trail. This helps add parking supply to the system. You might have noticed on Dan's parking supply slide, we're estimating 100 spots there. That's, again, subject to debate and negotiation, but we're assuming some amount of parking supply at Boscobel. And it also creates a stronger linkage between Boscobel and the village center. And you can see in fainter lines there connections between the train station and Boscobel that would be served in the reverse peak direction, so that a northbound train would meet the bus. Someone could take the shuttle bus from the station to Boscobel, but then northbound from there, it would just shoot straight north on 9D. The cons of this is that it's a longer route. There would be longer lead times, space between buses. It's more expensive to operate, and it has a somewhat complex service pattern because off-peak direction trips would serve the train station, peak direction trips would not. And so it would be designed to be maximally efficient, but it's a little more confusing than a shuttle that does the same thing on every trip. Next slide, please. So now we have another poll coming where we want to get your impressions of these three alternatives and to see what you think. And this is obviously of great concern to the village of Cold Spring, but we're interested in everyone's opinion. Do you think the shuttle service should go to the Cold Spring Metro North Station? Is it important because the train station is important? Would you say no because you don't want to increase traffic on Main Street? Or are you not sure because there are two sides to it? So we're getting great participation on this. The train station was out to an early lead, but then the no vote started catching up. We'll give it another few seconds. Great, I guess we'll close the poll there. And the vote for connecting it to the train station wins out by a small margin. 43% say the connection to the train station is critical. 35% said no, and 22% said they're not sure. So thank you for that input. That's very useful. And now we'll go on to the next slide. So we've talked a little bit about the alignment. Let's talk about the level of service on the shuttle, because that has a big impact on how attractive it would be. So I apologize for the amount of text on this slide, but there's a lot of information to share. There are 4 service periods, and this is similar to what Dan was referring to earlier. There's the peak season, which are summer and fall weekends and holidays from Memorial Day to the end of October. That's a total of about 50 days every year. There's the weekdays during that period from Memorial Day to the end of October. That's 107 days. There are the shoulder weekends in April, May, and November, including Thanksgiving. That's another 25 days. And then finally, there's the off-peak season that includes April, May, November weekdays and all days December through March. And that's 183 days, which is almost precisely 50% of the year. So what would be the span of service? What are the hours when the shuttle would operate? So during peak seasons, during peak days, we propose operating it from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. During the shoulder periods from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. There's less daylight during those times, so we figure there's less demand in the evening. And then in the off-peak, mainly during the winter, we could either have no service at all or a limited amount of service from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And it says for the transit intensive option there. And let me define what that means. We are carrying through 2 scenarios in this analysis to think about how much investment in transit we want to make for the shuttle service. And the transit intensive option overall has a higher level of service and more service during the year, because the goal there is to maximize the amount of people who would take transit. The traditional option, as we have it defined, would be more like a traditional transit service without being very intensive. And if we're thinking in the last section there about the frequency of service, under transit intensive, we'd have service every 10 minutes on weekends and every 20 minutes during weekdays and shoulder periods. But on the traditional model, there'd be less service operated every 15 minutes on weekends and every 30 minutes weekdays and shoulder. And under traditional, there would be no service at all in the winter. But in the transit intensive option, there would be some service available for people who wanted to get to Fjord Trail destinations without having to drive. So next slide, please. So now we have another poll question coming up to try to get your opinion about how much service to offer. So this question, the first question is whether the shuttle should be free or not. And this also could vary depending on whether it's the traditional or transit intensive. But we'll see what people think about whether there should be a fare or whether it should be free. Give it another few seconds. We have 77% voting. Okay, that looks great. We had 64% saying free, 36% saying charge, not quite 2 to 1, but a pretty strong majority in favor of free service. And going on. We did a survey earlier this fall, and some of you may have filled out the survey. And this poll keeps popping up on my screen. And the survey was sort of in 2 parts. The Fjord Trail put up signs at various trailheads encouraging people to take the online survey. And it was also emailed to everyone on the Fjord Trail's contact list and the contact lists of various partners. And you can see we got a very good response overall. 76% of people who saw the lawn signs responded to the survey. And of those, just more than half were local residents. And we got nearly 600 responses from people who received the link via email. And the vast majority of those were local residents. Just a couple of items about who this survey respondents were. Almost all of them had a car available all the time, 88%, and only 5% said rarely or never. So that's just something to keep in mind when we see later on how people feel about the shuttle, is that we're not talking about people who don't have a car available. Almost everybody did have a car available. And we did ask on the survey how often people visit destinations along the future Fjord Trail. And you can see that most of the people, that large blue section, which is not shown in the legend, but that's people who live in the area. But another quarter of people visit 3 to 5 times per year, and almost another quarter visit once or twice per year. There's very few people who responded to the survey who are either first-time visitors or very infrequent visitors. So these are people who are familiar with the area and familiar with the destinations along the trail. Next slide, please. This is also a picture of where people live. You can see that it's heavily dominated by people in the local area. And the pie chart on the left shows you again that the vast majority of people responding to the survey were people who were emailed the survey. And these are mostly people who live in the broader Hudson Highlands area. But you can see the red zones there include Beacon and Cold Spring and Phillipstown and places that are immediately adjacent to the trail. We have a little more detail in the next slide of the home zip codes of people who responded to the survey. 43% were in Cold Spring, Phillipstown zip code, another 15% in the Beacon zip code, 14% in Garrison, and the last 25 to 30% were spread around various other places, including the rest of Putnam and Dutchess County, some small number from New York City and Rockland County, some from Poughkeepsie, and about 9% from other areas that are not mentioned specifically. So just again, to keep in mind that the responses you're seeing are dominated by people who live in Cold Spring, Beacon, and some of the other communities in the local area. Next slide. So we asked which destinations in the broader Hudson Highlands State Park Preserve area people visited, and you can see them organized here, and the green bars indicate what the resident said, and the black bars indicated what the non-resident said. The most common place visited was the village of Cold Spring, with nearly 80% of respondents visiting that. Downtown Beacon was next at nearly 70%. Little Stony Point Washburn Trail was very popular among residents and also non-residents. It's interesting that Breakneck Ridge was one of the few locations where non-residents outnumbered residents, and that was among the most common places to visit for non-residents, second only to the village of Cold Spring. You can also see that Mount Beacon barely was edged out, the non-residents edged out the residents there. There were several people who cited other choices. You can see them listed at the bottom of the most common ones. Fonsdock State Park, the Foundry Preserve, Garrison, and Boscobel were other places that people mentioned as visiting on some regular basis. Next slide, please. We asked how people got to their destinations in the park area. And you can see what the answers are here. Again, the green bars are for residents, the black bars are for non-residents. So in terms of driving, non-residents were more likely to drive because you can see over on the right side that residents were much more likely to walk, with nearly 40% of residents walking to destinations, which again included the village of Cold Spring, downtown Beacon, where many of these respondents would have lived. Non-residents were more likely to drive, whether they drove alone, whether they drove with family or with friends. And in terms of taking the train, that was pretty much exclusively for non-residents, as you'd expect. If you live in the area, you're not going to hop on the train to go one station, with very rare exceptions. At the bottom, you can see that overall 60% of residents drive and park, and 85% of visitors drive and park. And if you combine everyone, you find that 66% of total respondents drive and park. And if that number sounds familiar, that's exactly the number that we were using in the analysis of parking demand and was substantiated by other surveys. So that gave us a high degree of confidence in that figure as the current mode share for access to the park. Next slide, please. We did ask among people who said they were not using Metro North, why weren't you using Metro North? And you can see these are sorted from the smallest responses to the largest. The largest response was, I live here, so of course it doesn't make sense to use Metro North for that case. Or the second highest is not convenient to get to the train from where I live, or I prefer to drive. Smaller responses where the fare is too high, or the service doesn't run frequently enough, or doing other side trips. That was about 12% of respondents. So for people who did not use Metro North, it was for generally logical reasons. Next slide. We asked how long people stayed in the area, and you can see that a little more than half in the green area say, well, I live here, so I'm here all the time. But the most common answer to this among people who didn't live in the area was 2 to 4 hours. You can see it's about a quarter of the responses said 2 to 4 hours, and the next most common was 4 to 6 hours. So between those two responses, that's about 40% of total responses. A few people were there under 2 hours, and smaller numbers were there either 6 to 8 hours or more than 8 hours. Excuse me, next slide, please. We asked all the respondents about their awareness of the Fjord Trail, if they had heard of it, and how they felt about it. And 95% of respondents had heard of the Fjord Trail. And among local residents, the figure was almost universal. 99% say they'd have heard of it, and almost 80% of visitors had heard of the Fjord Trail. And we asked, how are you interested in it? What's your degree of interest? And the vast majority said that they're very excited about the Fjord Trail, 68%. Another 20% said they may be interested in, and 12% said that they were not interested in the Fjord Trail. So there is a lot of future interest once the park opens. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides here have to do with whether people would use a shuttle service if it were offered to them. So we started with a very general question about asking if there was a convenient shuttle to take you to various places in the Hudson Islands area, would you use it? And you can see that about a third said yes, very likely. About half said perhaps, depends how it ran, and about 20% said no, that they wouldn't be likely to use it. And we did find that non-residents were slightly more likely than residents to say yes to this question. So on the next slide, following on from that introductory generic question, we asked about a number of specific features of the shuttle that might affect their usage. And so these 7 different options were given, and people were asked to say how important it is to them. And the most important option that people said would affect their usage was if the shuttle offered fast, direct connections to the key destinations between Cold Spring and Beacon. The next most important was flexibility to get on or off wherever you'd like. And the next most important after that was very frequent service, at least every 15 minutes or better. The least important of these, although not unimportant, were comfortable vehicles, coordination with train arrivals and departures, and the two in the middle, no fare and direct service to shops in Cold Spring and Beacon, were sort of middling responses with an average of 3. We followed up that question, sorry, go back. We followed up that question with another query about, well, knowing this now about the shuttle, how likely is it that you'd use it if it had all these features? And we find that the number of people saying very likely goes up significantly. It's probably 45% say very likely, and another 40% say somewhat likely, and small numbers say unlikely or definitely not. That's less than 20%. And if you just pop back one slide and you compare the compare that one, where you see, only about a third said very likely. Once we add those features and going into the next slide, we get to nearly half. So people, once they understood the shuttle better, were more likely to say that they would use the shuttle. Next slide, please. We then asked 2 specific features to get a little more detail about, well, what if there was a fare charged, or what if the frequency was not as good as what we described? So if we charged a fare of $1 or $2, would that change your usage or not? And a significant number said a fare of $1 or $2 would not change their usage. About 25% of people would say that their usage would be reduced if a fare were charged. But if the service ran less frequently, like every 30 minutes instead of every 10 or 15 minutes, there was a much more significant reduction in interest, where 50% of people said that they would use the shuttle less if it ran every 30 minutes. So that convenience, that high frequency of service is important. And fare is not unimportant, but it's not quite as important as the frequency of service. Next slide. So there are several other considerations about charging a fare or not. And you already voiced your opinion about charging a fare or not, and the no fare won, not quite 2 to 1. But here are some things to think about. That charging a fare based on typical non-urban shuttle routes would not generate a significant amount of the operating cost. Probably 10 to 15% is typical for a service like that. It's likely that ridership would be 30 to 40% lower than a fare-free service. You saw on the previous slide, it said 25%, but people who answered that were probably thinking only about, well, $1 or $2 is not a lot of money. But if you think about, well, I have to have some cash available. Well, I have to then pay at the door. Well, I have to get an app or something. And it's much more inconvenient to pay the fare than just getting on a free shuttle. That's why the reduction in ridership is probably greater than the 25% from the survey response. Those shuttle trips would take longer if you charge the fare, just because it takes a while for people to get on the bus and pay their fares. And there are costs associated with handling and processing fare revenue. Even if there's not a lot of cash involved, there's still costs associated with it. And overall, a fare undermines the pro-transit message. If we want to maximize the number of people taking transit, then charging a fare is not the way to do that. Offering it for free really maximizes the pro-transit message. Next slide, please. So now we have one more poll question. This may be the last one, I'm not sure, but this poll question, and it'll pop up in a second. Oops.
I have no more poll questions.
Okay, maybe the fair poll question was supposed to be here and it just came a little bit early. All right, so assume you just did the fair question over and over again. So now we'll go on. So just another couple of things to think about in terms of the shuttle service. ADA, for those of you not familiar with it, is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Whenever you run a shuttle service, you have to think about accessibility. And the Fjord Trail in general is being designed to be accessible, and it's an important theme of the Fjord Trail. Thus, the shuttle system will also be accessible. The fleet will include at least one lift-equipped van, and it'll be part of the regular service, or it could be deployed on demand if a passenger who needs to use a wheelchair or has some mobility assistance requests it. That is to say, we're going to provide that service, but it's actually not required by the Americans with Disabilities Act for a couple of technical reasons. The primary business is not transportation, so HHFT doesn't actually have to do it. And the proposed vehicles are going to have fewer than 16 seats, thus they're not required to be accessible. But in spite of that, the fleet will include accessible vans. And on the next slide, we can see what those vehicles may look like. This is a modified Ford Transit van. We're proposing to use 15 passenger vans like this, which could be a Mercedes Sprinter or a Ford Transit. These have 14 or 15 seats. The lift-equipped versions of these are available, but they only have 6 seats, and that's why we wouldn't want every vehicle in the fleet to be lift-equipped, because that would really cut into the passenger capacity. All vehicles would include bike racks. The current cost of these is rather high, about $120,000, and if you include a lift, that adds another $30,000. But that cost is very likely to come down in coming years as these vehicles become more available. Mercedes currently sells electrified Sprinter vans in Europe. They don't quite do it in the US yet, but they're proposing to do that in 2023. And so by the time the Fjord Trail opens, it's very likely that there'll be greater availability and lower costs. Next slide, please. So to start summing up, these are the key takeaways from the study thus far. And as I said at the beginning, these are not final findings, but these are our draft recommendations. That on the parking side, that new parking capacity will be provided to accommodate demand. That it's proposed that fees will apply to all Fjord Trail parking spaces, and that there'll be information technology, and that's key to the efficient use of the capacity and to minimize frustration, that people will know where to find a parking space. They'll have free parking available if they want it at Beacon Metro North Station. And then to get around between the parking locations, there'll be a shuttle. The most attractive service would be frequent and fare free. The service levels would be designed to meet demand efficiently with high levels of service during the peak season and lower levels of service at other times. And that we're proposing to have electric vans provide all the service, that they would be quiet, sustainable, and provide comfortable rides. So the next slide is our next steps as we wrap up this project over the next few months. We're planning to have discussions with Putnam and Dutchess County officials, how to coordinate the proposed service with existing transit services in those counties. There will be another meeting with Cold Spring, a public meeting sometime in January. The date's yet to be determined. We'll hear more directly from Cold Spring residents and officials. We will then refine recommendations based on community feedback, including what we're going to hear from you tonight and what we'll hear in those future meetings. And then we will prepare a final report. And with that, we thank you very much for your patience and attendance tonight. It's very important that we hear your opinions. We know it's a lot of information to give. And as was mentioned at the beginning, this has been recorded. So if you want to go back and watch it again, if you feel like you missed something, you will have that opportunity. And with that, I will pass it along to Drew to begin the question and answer session.
All right, thanks, Steve and Dan for presenting that. And thanks everyone for your questions throughout this presentation. Looks like we've gotten a lot of great questions, and I'm going to hand it over to MJ to give a quick rundown of the logistics of the Q&A session.
Great, thanks, Drew. I know our panelists are raring to go and answer your questions. I'm going to be kind of distributing those questions as we go. We've got a lot of questions. And so just some kind of ground rules as we start. So questions will appear in the Q&A dialog box as they are being fielded by a panelist. And out of respect for everyone's time, we're going to focus on questions that are relevant to the topic of the webinar, which is parking and the shuttle service. We've answered some questions that were not related to those topics in chat, and we'll continue to do that as we progress. If your question doesn't get answered, feel free to reach out to us at another time to ask that question, and we'll get you an answer. Some questions are duplicates. We have some folks that are basically, asking things on the same topic. So I'm going to consolidate some questions just in the interest of time. But let's start with a question for Drew. And this is from Tara Vamos. Who would be tasked with parking enforcement?
That's a great question, and something we've put some thought into. I'd say the number one sort of answer to that is that engineering controls created by the Fjord Trail are going to sort of handle a lot of parking enforcement. If you look in the master plan at the breakneck plan, there is essentially a lot of curbs and controlled area where it will be either our official parking spots of shoulder, safe shoulder parking in conjunction with a DOT plan to lower speed limits and add a bunch of signage and safety measures, as well as pull-in spots in parking lots. And so the actual sort of engineering controls of the site will take care of a lot of that. In terms of enforcement personnel, the Fjord Trail is going to have a lot of, boots on the ground to be able to help with parking enforcement. And we'll have, like we saw Dan's presentation of the different options for parking enforcement within the lots. And unfortunately, obviously, outside of the Fjord Trail area on, state highways, et cetera, that will still be left to local and state law enforcement, and hopefully that in bringing the Fjord Trail to this area, that we may help with personnel. I know that the especially state park police is very strapped for personnel resources, but we'll be sort of working on that in the next phases, not in their staffing, but in terms of being able to have more staff for the Fjord Trail that may help to ease the burden on other agencies.
Yeah,
Thanks, Drew.
Dan, could you speak a little bit to the sort of camera options and what you had heard from some of the providers of those technologies in terms of enforcement and good behavior of paying?
Yeah, so it's a combination of strategies. So, what Drew was mentioning about shoulder parking, the plan is to kind of physically limit the ability of people to park in unsafe manners, which is not really done today. I mean, the amount of parking area that's legally allowed to be parked is kind of controlled by traffic cones, which is not exactly the most effective way to do so. So so people are readily able to park beyond the limits of where they're allowed to today. In the Hudson Highlands Fjord Trail parking lots, the technology solutions that we're looking at are really meant to automate a lot of the enforcement, if that's the direction that we want to go in, and kind of take some of the personnel resources that would be required to enforce parking within the off-street lots, and kind of automate some of that to reduce costs and actually improve efficiency, really, at the end of the day.
Dan, I have two questions that I'm going to group together because I think you can answer them rather quickly. Alan Spiegel asks, how do the monitoring systems, particularly video, perform in rain, snow, day, night, etc.? And David Watson asked if paying for parking could occur through Easy Pass.
Both good questions. So I'll take the second one first. So Easy Pass is accepted as automated payment at the Port Authority airport parking lots, as many of you may know. So that is an option to be integrated into the system as part of an automated pay. And then to answer the first question, the technology has advanced to a point where this technology works at night and in the snow. However, the peak demand for the park would happen during the day, and when it's not snowing. Not to say there is no demand during the winter, but it does work, although the primary focus would be during warmer, brighter times.
So I have another question for you, Dan. Lots of parking questions from Rebecca Ramirez. Will the pay options allow for cash payments? Would love to advocate for that in case people do not have a credit card. Thank you.
Yeah, well, they can. A lot of people do. A lot of these systems are designed for electronic payments, and a lot of because of the ubiquitousness of smartphone usage these days, a lot of them even offer automated, almost chatbot pay services, so you can pay through an app without even having a credit card. So there are costs associated with handling cash, just like there's costs associated with handling cash on the shuttle service. There's also a time delay. I'm not saying that we're advocating against accepting cash as an absolute, but there's things to consider there as well.
I would think that the pay kiosk would be the best place to handle cash, and that may be part of any frictionless system.
Yep.
Okay, we have a question from Bradford Petrie. Amy, maybe you can field this one. Is there a plan to incentivize parking at the Metro North lots?
Sure. At the Beacon lot, yes. In conversations with the village, they are hoping to keep the spotlight off of the Metro North lot there so that it can continue to serve as a sort of auxiliary parking supply in the village. And so when we are promoting and publicizing locations for parking, we would not highlight the Cold Spring Station to make sure that that's available for other visitation uses, which abound for the village.
Great.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the parking at Cold Spring is not part of our system, or Hudson Islands Fjord Trail system, I should say. So it will be a free resource if people want to make the drive there. So that is another way to kind of
The Cold Spring lot. The Cold
Beacon
Spring
lot,
Park.
the Beacon Metro, yeah, the Beacon
Train
Metro.
station lot, yeah.
So Cold Spring would not be advertised. Beacon might be advertised as an alternate location, but not Cold Spring.
Okay. We have a question from Rich Franco. He's asking, what are projected Fjord Trail staffing numbers when it's fully open in 2028? Amy, do you have a crystal ball for that?
MJ and Drew know as well as I do. We're building out a staffing plan to sink in by phase for those staffing levels. And so I don't know if we're publishable yet on what those numbers are, but it'd be a base staff of let's say 25 to 30, and then have some seasonal staff on top of that for the peak months.
Great. Okay, we have a question, Stephen, for you from Mel Leitner. Given the number of folks you hope to divert from cars to transit, how many vans at 15 passengers each will you require?
The projections at this point for and it partly depends on which option we choose for the southern terminus, but it's somewhere in the range of 8 or 9 vans to run service every 10 or 15 minutes. And so, when you think about people arriving in groups at a train station, there could be many people arriving at once, and that might overwhelm one van. But a lot of those people are going to be walking to their destination, whether it's at Breakneck Ridge or at Beacon, maybe going to Long Dock Park there. So we do have the plan for 8+ vans to be in service at any given time. And that will be phased up, probably not at the very beginning of when the Fjord Trail opens, but over time, phase up into that. And if it turns out that that's not enough, that the demand is overwhelming, then we can always just add a few more vans to the system to accommodate the additional number of riders.
Great. Okay. Sven Albrand is asking if there are any plans for bicycle parking as well. Drew, you want to take that?
Yes, as a avid cyclist, I'd love to take that one. Absolutely. While that wasn't necessarily part of this study exactly, that's part of the site planning efforts for the parking lots that have already underway with our landscape architects. There'll be ample bicycle parking. And in terms of the shuttle, there'll be ample bike racks on the shuttles themselves. And one of the kind of fun uses of the shuttle would be for, residents or people parking to be able to ride the trail, one direction from Beacon or Cold Spring and put their bike on the shuttle and take it back to Cold Spring or vice versa from Beacon, or for a family to park at one of the lots and be able to, so yeah, both park by bike at the trail or, ride your bike to the trail, take a shuttle to another part or take it home. So very excited for all the bike infrastructure.
Great. Okay, so I think this is a good one for Dan. Amy, you might want to chime in as well on this. This is from Kyle Good, and she asks, will local residents who live in Garrison or in Cold Spring, but outside the village and frequently hike or take walks, be given permits to park free or to park free on weekdays? Many residents, especially seniors, frequently walk at Little Stony Point or on other paths, trails for exercise and will want to use the HHFT if it comes to pass.
It is certainly something that we're considering as part of this, and we've had discussions about exactly that, the seasonal pass in conjunction with resident passes. It's something that's being considered. It's not, I don't think any decisions made, so I'll defer to Amy on that, but it's certainly in the toolbox of ideas that we're working with here.
Sure, that's accurate. And we have 2 years to keep working on some of the system functions in terms of fees. And one thing we want to make sure, in the design and the programming and also in this sort of fee structure, that this remains something that's really usable by locals, and there are some community benefits, right? So having some sort of a locals pass to the trail would be a good example of that. So just rough ideas at this point in time, but we'd love to advance those types of conversations.
Okay, we have a question from Evan Thompson. What will keep people from parking in the Cold Spring Village when lots are full? I don't know. Who wants to take this? Amy, you want to take it?
Sure. And this is actually, we are getting close on time, so I just want to be mindful of that. So as part of the study, the scope of the consultants included taking a review of the Village of Cold Springs parking recommendations for different tools they might use to control parking in the village. That was reviewed. We had a separate meeting with representatives from the village, including village board, planning board, and parking committee members to review that. I know the village itself has been working on sort of taking that study out and working towards implementation of those strategies. And so we wanted that to be included in the study because we think it's really important to the system function. So if we have our parking lots, it's sort of a mutual benefit, right? So the village doesn't want overflow parking going to the village. We don't want overflow parking going to the village. If we want to have a robust parking and shuttle system that, people are paying the fee and parking and going on the shuttle, it would undermine our system to park somewhere else. And the village certainly wants to make sure that parking is available for residents or visitors to the village itself. So this really has to be implemented as a companion strategy. This is one of the topics we hope to do a deeper dive in at the Cold Spring Focus session we'll be hosting in January.
Okay, maybe we can take 2 more questions. We had a number of questions, Amy, about the 35% number. And I figured if there are a few people who asked that, there are probably more who are wondering about it. So maybe we could talk about where that 35% growth number came from and why we're employing it as we study.
Sure, and Dan can hop in here too if you'd like. We had a robust conversation on projections through this preparation. So the 35% projection was generated as part of the environmental review for what the project visitation number would be, and that was generated by AKRF. So this consultant team looked at that, but obviously was working to carry forward numbers as well for consistency's sake. And that will be presented. I think that I saw a number of questions on that and people seeking for there to be more of a range of options to kind of push and pull on that a little bit. That might be a good thing for us to dig into a little bit and have more concentrated conversation when we think about the visitation and what we think that will look like with our visitation management consultant, because we hope in the early spring of next year, we'll be able to have some models that might actually help illustrate how all of this works together, so that, you know, current patterns aren't just more, there's changes to those patterns, and what does that look like if we model that? So that, I think, could be a nice session, combining those two things into one kind of discussion.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that is that, you know, 35% in terms of absolute numbers is a relatively significant growth over existing. And the other thing that's important to point out as well in advance of, you know, this future session is that when we talk about the future parking supply that's planned, it's currently projected for greater than what our projected demand is going to be. And, you know, for any parking system, you don't necessarily want to provide 100% capacity for 100% demand. Otherwise, you're going to have people driving around. So there is a buffer built into that that projected parking demand versus projected future supply. And again, the overflow, you know, contingency option is Beacon Metro North, which has a significant amount of parking capacity and will be served by the future shuttle.
And I'll just emphasize the 35%, when we look at the tables, that's by 2028, which was at that time full build out. So that's not happening overnight. That's not happening when phase one opens. That's sort of the cumulative impact over time. And it's inclusive of an existing trend where visitation has been going up on an annual basis. So it's a complicated piece. I think we need to have more dedicated, focused conversation on that with the right people in the room. But that's that 35 is that build out, not sort of when phase one, which is breakneck connector, is open. So that's a gradual increase over time.
So I'm going to end with one more question, and I think, Amy, this may be best answered by you or Drew. It's from Brian Rubino, and he's asking, he says, I'm just confused about the timeline regarding cutting down on pedestrian traffic along Fair Street. I thought the Fjord Trail from Dockside to Little Stony Point was supposed to help address that.
On Fair Street?
Yeah, I guess talking about people walking along Fair Street in terms of how people are getting from one zone to the next, or shuttle stops perhaps that's related to.
Well, if the shuttle were in the village, that would be an option for people to hop on the shuttle at the Cold Spring Station and take that out. But the current master plan, you know, the current pattern of behaviors for most people to walk down Fair Street. This plan would place the primary route through Dockside Park and along the causeway. So basically getting people out of the village as quickly as possible. And that would reduce, hopefully significantly, the volume of people opting to still walk down Fair Street. So it's about changing the pattern of the behavior on the ground.
Yeah, I think I brought it up just in the context of the short option. If the shuttle terminated at Little Stony Point, and only in the period before the full Fjord Trail is completed down to Dockside. So just in that 3-year span, if we went for the short option, then there would be more pedestrian traffic on Fair Street. But in other cases and later on, that wouldn't be an issue anymore.
Okay, great. Do we have time for one more, or we're already over time? And we've got a lot of questions. So I feel like if we can take these questions back and maybe create some sort of an answer sheet for the future for some of the questions that were not answered, maybe that would be a better use of everybody's time. We could stay here until, I think, 9:30 if we allowed ourselves to. We've got a lot of questions. Want to do one more and then we'll wrap? Let's do it. Okay. Nikki Meehan asks, if parking is created, will that prevent parking on 9D, or will it become illegal to park beyond the white line over the shoulder?
On 90.
On 9D.
So the proposed improvements on 90, we would eliminate all parking on 90 at Little Stony Point Washburn lot. And the plan would be to eliminate any southbound on-street parking at Breakneck area. And there would be limited parking on the northbound lane only. In that area of 77 parking spaces, but those would be moved out of the lane of travel. There would be formal painted spaces with a curb so people can't park in a non-parallel parking manner. And it would be very much reduced from the current parking behavior today. What that would do is also, it's part of the traffic calming package that enables us to reduce the speed limit, which we think is an important factor for keeping this area safe, given how many pedestrians still would be crossing the road from Washburn Trailhead back over to the parking lots on the other side. So that's part of a package, and that's the design, but it will be much safer and more managed than it is today.
Great. As I said, we have a whole lot of questions that we were not able to get to. And we're going to see if there's a way that we can, gather together some information for folks related to these questions that we can distribute, just so that people get answers to their questions. But other than that, we've got the recording of this webinar that you can look at again and review. And as Stephen and I think Drew also mentioned, we've got a number of next steps. This isn't the final step in the plan. So we'll be working with the Village of Cold Spring going forward on a workshop on specific issues that affect the village related to parking and shuttle. And then Stephen and Dan are going to consolidate all the input and all the data, and they're going to give us a final report that we will be sharing out. So on behalf of Hudson Highlands Fjord Trail, I'd like to thank everyone for participating. And as I said, I'm sorry, we were not able to answer all the questions that there were. There were some great questions, but hopefully we'll be able to get you something so that you can hear those ideas and thoughts. Certainly Stephen and Dan will be incorporating them into their thinking as we move forward, and we will too. So thanks very much for spending your evening with us. We appreciate it. Have a good night.